Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm Donald Nally. I know half the people in this room, which is awesome, maybe 2/3. And I'm the conductor of The Crossing, and I will be hosting our little talk, so thank you so much for being here. The concert tonight is really meaningful to The Crossing on a number of levels. It opens with a piece that is not the Book of Never, and the piece that we're going to be talking about primarily, but I thought I would mention it first. It's a piece by Gavin Bryars that was premiered just last Saturday in Philadelphia, and it's in its full form, it's a concert-length unaccompanied piece that is a setting of De Quincey's essay that is a translation of an eyewitness of the Immanuel Kant's last days. And so the piece is called The Last Days of Immanuel Kant. And basically Gavin Bryars formed, he used a kind of eraser technique to form a libretto and cut, I don't know, three-quarters of the words of the essay, maybe more, out, and told little kind of scenes from the progress. And really, basically, it's about watching and experiencing this great mind go through what many, if not all of us at some point go through, right? Which is the decay of his mental capacity, and as a result of that, the kind of decay of his life. So there's a really poignant moment in it where it's actually the last movement we're singing, where he was a very strict and regimented person. He had a routine from the time he was 4 to that, and he never changed. He always ate at the same time. He always ate at the same table. He had, a window of the number of guests he could have at the table. He always went on a walk to, the same day, at the same time every day. And those habits begin to disappear because he can't do them anymore. And so there's the last thing that we'll sing for you is that so ended Kant's wandering in the world, because he at one point just says, I'm happy here at home. And it's really quite a beautiful moment textually as well as musically. So that there is a very sort of distant relationship between the town in which Kant lived and the fact that it is now part of Russia, which is part of our theme here. But other than that, it's really about Kant's, the essay really is very interesting in that it incorporates all these little tiny things about Kant's like discoveries and theories, and so there's a moment when we like sing about force, and there's a moment when we sing about theorizing, and of course Kant was trying to like figure out. Newton handed him all this stuff about gravity, and so he was like trying to figure all this stuff about the world out, and he figured a lot of it out actually. So that's the first half. Then we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back and do Aaron Helgeson's piece. And this has been quite a journey, because we were just laughing about the fact that the first piece that we did together was a really pretty short piece called Away Far Home, and we did it at this concert we call The Crossing at Christmas, which is never really about Christmas, and it was actually a pretty violent piece at times, and it was a really devastating piece. It's beautiful. It's from it's Hiroshima Mon Amour, right?
Same screenwriter, yeah.
Okay.
It's called L'Amour.
L'Amour, right,
by
yeah.
Marguerite Duras.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, we got talking, and he got talking about palimpsest and this possibility of making this piece, and I was really intrigued by the ideas of histories and cultures and the preservation of the attempt to preserve a culture in an oppressed society, and also the mystery behind the story that's being told by this monk, who I'm going to let you talk about. That there's we have a little bit of concrete stuff because we know what happened to the town, and we have a lot of mysterious stuff because we don't know exactly what this document says, right? And so I'll talk a little bit later about how it feels to sing what Aaron has done with it, because he's basically created the fabric of the document in a musical way, in a musical structure, and a musical texture. So I'm going to introduce our composer, Aaron Helgeson, who's the reason that we're all here. In fact, the reason that we're in this beautiful church. He's very good friends with Vince, the pastor here, and
Jared. Yeah.
Jared, sorry,
Yeah.
Jared, the pastor here. You went to Oberlin together, you
Yeah.
said? And so we get invited into this amazing space here in New York to sing this amazing piece. So talk to us.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. I'll just also mention there is another kind of strange connection between Kant and just the topic that we're going to be talking about today, which is, of course, Ukrainian sovereignty and kind of the history of religion in Ukraine, which is that a Russian official has blamed Kant for the democratization of Ukraine, and then blamed, of course, the current Russia's current war on Ukraine on that. So a kind of dubious connection. But like Donald mentioned, we got started talking about this larger project, and this was back in 2017. And I was really interested in finding a palimpsest text. A lot of my music these days focuses on collage of historical sources, so the research element is really interesting to me. And I kept looking for things and just didn't find the right thing, and then I went down what we all do with Wikipedia, a little Wikipedia rabbit hole, and found this Novgorod Codex, which is an artifact from, they've dated it to 999 AD. It was in the village of Novgorod, and they excavated it in 2000 when they were excavating the entire village for artifacts. And it's a book of psalms that's made out of wood. So the psalms that were in it were originally carved into the wood. And as best we can tell, it was owned by a dualistic monk from Kiev. This is during the period of Kievan Rus that Novgorod was a part of. You know, everything is kind of centered around Kiev at that point. And so this was a monk from Kiev sent to the village of Novgorod to convert the village from paganism to Orthodox Christianity. And in doing that, he combined pagan and Christian worship, and the church got word of this, and he and the entire village were excommunicated. And I'll maybe defer to you, Pavlo, on some of the more specific elements of this, but back then that probably would have meant destruction of texts and a lot of historical documents. And so this monk, in attempting to preserve the history of the village, the culture, his liturgy, and even the alphabet and the kind of structure of the language. This is the earliest written example of the Rus language. And so what he did was he would pour a layer of wax over each page of these psalms, use a stylus to write into that wax, and then make a rubbing of the impressions of the stylus on the wax. Pour another layer of wax over it, repeat that process. So they've been trying to figure out how many layers are in this. It's at least 96 to 150 is kind of what we're thinking. So it's what would be called a hyper palimpsest, meaning that there's multiple palimpsests on top of one another. And in that, he wrote his liturgy. There's stories about the village and the excommunication of the village. There's these long, repetitive tracts of really vitriolic language that are all verbs that are conjugated differently and scribbled like in the margins is the alphabet. And so clearly he was trying to track that language, but at the same time, there's this passage that just is 5 or 6 different conjugations of the word smashing for an entire page. And so incredible text, and it was kind of analyzed and teased apart by a linguist named Andrei Zalesniak. basically what he would do, it's kind of like the New York Times strands puzzle, where you find a character somewhere in this wax, and you say, okay, here's one character, and now I'm going to go out from there and see if I can find another character, start to make sense of that word, and just keep expanding from there. So it's been painstaking work, and Smytsnyuk actually passed away the day after that I started working on this piece. I hadn't realized that, but I'd hoped to get in touch with him to talk about the Novgorod Codex, but a lot of strange coincidences with this piece. So I started work on that in 2017 at a time when, it's the first Trump presidency. There's a whole lot happening in the world. I think those of us who were paying attention to politics at the time could kind of see the writing on the wall in terms of what his relationship with Ukraine and with Russia was. And so, I worked on this piece for 3 or 4 years, and it just kind of kept getting more and more relevant. And so what I wanted to do was connect those stories that are recorded in the Novgorod Codex with kind of a more contemporary sense of different writers in exile. So text in the piece, you'll find Gertrude Stein, Oscar Wilde, Angela Davis, by way of the Rolling Stones, who talk about Angela Davis in one of their albums. Just kind of mishmashing all of this together and kind of dividing things up into individual words and juxtaposing them on top of one another. And so the piece really distills a lot of those ideas of being away from home and being outside of the world, as Al Margulies, who is not here today, but originally was going to be on this panel, has said, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There's so much to say about the piece. I don't know, I could go on forever, but I'll leave it there for now, and we'll have some time maybe to talk about that.
So I do want to talk about the experience of singing it, but I think we should hear from the other people that are here. So I think I'll ask Leah to talk for a second. I am going to read this because I don't want to introduce. This is Leah Batstone, and she's a historical musicologist. She founded and is the creative director of the Ukraine Contemporary Music Festival. And also you work on Ukraine music of the past century and contemporary composers and projects. So we'd like you to talk a little bit about some of the connections you see across the history of Ukrainian music and what's currently happening in Ukraine musical space given Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, first of all. Thank you, Aaron, for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here and to contribute my perspective, which hopefully adds something to kind of the contemporary relevance of some of these ideas. So I started looking into contemporary music, music making, new music, classical music making in Ukraine. I undertook my first kind of serious research in 2019. And one of the things that really drew me to the topic was that I was noticing after the Revolution of Dignity, which happened in 2014, and was the beginning of Russia's war in Ukraine, how much kind of interesting, experimental, surprising musical programming was going on, and that there was kind of this shift after 2014, even kind of big institutions that you would expect to maybe take some time to adjust to a new cultural orientation were programming a lot of Ukrainian composers, a lot of contemporary music. And it just really piqued my interest, especially living in a place like New York City, where you sort of think you're in the center of the musical world, the center of musical innovation, to encounter some pretty innovative and exciting things elsewhere. And so that is what prompted me to start the Ukrainian Contemporary Music Festival here in New York, which happens every spring. And we had our 6th season in March. But as a researcher, I started looking at Ukrainian art music traditions on the other side of the century in the early 20th century, which was kind of coming out of my musicological background working on modernist composers. I wrote my first book on Mahler. And so one of the things that I noticed, though, was there was this really fascinating kind of parallel between the musical spaces in contemporary Ukraine and what it was happening in Ukraine in musical contexts 100 years earlier. And specifically, there was this really wonderful kind of tension between composers and music, artists, not just composers, but performers, doing a lot of experimental things and kind of experimenting in sort of every possible direction. And at the same time, kind of looking back and reflecting on traditional music making, particularly folk music practices, and kind of honoring that kind of in combination with this very sort of progressive music making. It's something that, for example, in contemporary music, we see with a composer like Alla Zahakiewicz, who is the first Ukrainian composer to attend IRCAM in Paris, where she writes these incredible electroacoustic compositions that also utilize like this very ancient form of Ukrainian folk singing called white-voiced singing. And that comes from time that she spent as kind of an ethnographic participant in this folk ensemble called Drevo. So kind of bringing these two very sort of seemingly separate things together into a really unique blend is something that was happening also in the 1920s. And I think one of the best ways of thinking about that time period and the things that sort of led to that creative impulse comes from a historian of Ukraine, Miroslav Shkandry, who talks about Ukraine in that period of the 1920s being involved in kind of these dual revolutions of national liberation and also social liberation. And kind of Ukrainians for the first time having this freedom as a modern nation state. Ukraine was an independent nation state from 1917 to 1920, very short-lived. But in that time period, having the freedom to both forge ahead with all of this exciting new modes of governance and new modes of artistic, creative work, but also actually for the first time, the freedom to look backwards as well at this culture that has been oppressed and marginalized by the various empires that have ruled Ukraine for centuries. So I think if anything, that impulse has really, I have noticed that impulse kind of intensify since the full-scale invasion. It, I think, is the biggest takeaway should be that Ukrainian creativity has in some ways really like bloomed in kind of defiance to what is happening. And a lot of the projects and the concerts and the music that's being made is really groundbreaking and incredible, not just because it's being produced under kind of daily bombing of civilians, but also because I think there's this real invigoration to both make sure that people understand that Ukraine is a contemporary place, is a modern nation, and also that it has this really ancient culture. I think we often assign value to a place on the basis of its age, and Ukraine, I mean, Kievan Rus far predates the existence of Muscovy, let alone many other sort of empires of the world. And so I think there's been in some ways an intensification of that actually today since the full-scale invasion started in 2022. I've been back 4 times since the full-scale invasion started, and 3 of those were in association with performances. So performances are happening, and again, they're often very culturally significant and exciting, and they range from sort of new things, like colleagues of mine composed a new opera that was staged within a museum in the center of Kyiv that had been emptied because to protect the artworks. So the artworks had been moved into storage, and this empty museum was sitting there, and these colleagues of mine were like, we should write an opera for this empty museum. And so, you have this like amazing use of the situation, which is dire and terrible and tragic, but to create something completely cool and new that would not be created under other circumstances. And then also a kind of reinvigorating of historically significant works. So for instance, the 1930 opera by Boris Lietoshinsky, The Golden Hoop, was just premiered for the first time since Ukraine gained independence in Lviv last month. So, I mean, these things are still happening and are happening in some ways with like a really exciting energy. And yeah, I think that's probably the most important takeaway that I've observed in kind of the Ukrainian creative space since the full-scale invasion.
Can I follow up? How much of the stuff that is going on right now do you think is focused on resistance topics?
I would say in some way almost all of it, but much of it not overtly. And I think that is also something that has been important in the discourse that I've observed, and also in a discourse that I hope to participate in, which is to insist on the fact that Ukraine and Ukrainian creativity and music and art and everything exists beyond Russia's abuses of Ukraine. So, you know, Ukraine has existed before Russia. Ukraine will exist afterwards. Ukrainian culture is not dependent on Russia's, marginalization of it. And I've had colleagues sort of say to me, in some ways we have to ignore Russia because we're sort of playing into this narrative of Ukraine's existence by virtue of its relationship to Russia. And that's really not the narrative that is either true or is one that we want to stick with people. But of course, when you have family members and friends and many musicians dying, both as civilians in their homes and also as soldiers on the front line, there also is a need to address that and to make sure it's not forgotten, especially for international audiences. And given everything that's going on, of course it's hard to kind of keep the focus on one catastrophe amidst many. So
thanks. That's relevant to the circles that we live in right now, and that's really helpful. Alfred Margulies was supposed to join us, and he isn't able to be here. So he wrote this remarks that he was going to offer, and so I'm going to offer those now, and then we'll turn to Pavlo. So unfortunately, he had a family medical emergency. He's a Harvard psychoanalyst, and we were really looking forward to having his voice here. So I'll do my best, but it's not going to be his voice, but it is his words. Al and Aaron have worked together just last year at the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute on a psychoanalysis of the Book of Never. And he's written extensively on the psychology of erasure and longing for home after traumatic shock. Al sent us these remarks, and I'll try to do him justice. The Book of Never, Aaron writes, lasts 2/3 of an hour, but it took 1,000 years to make. Humbly and in awe, I submit the Book of Never is still being written. We were astonished 3 weeks ago by the bold, ingenious Ukrainian drone attack launched deep into Russia. The hope for peace, though, remains fragile, a thin reed spiraling into an unknown future. I use the phrase falling out of the world to convey the shock of existential dislocation, a shaking loose from familiar bearings, and a falling into disorientation and bewilderment. We cannot understand such evil. Lost in time and space, we search for a compass that will direct us back into life as we once knew it. Trauma, though, in its unrelenting destructive newness, locks onto our accustomed worldview and demands a revision of what we have always taken for granted. Trauma then both outstrips understanding and is at the same time a new kind of understanding. Trauma's new meaning is precisely that our familiar, taken for granted world no longer holds. Trauma rips apart the seamless grounding of everyday experience, and it is into this gash that we fall. That is, we fall away from the familiar into the strange, far away from our home in the world. Like Aaron, I too have explored layered, overdetermined memories in the unconscious that resonate together, thereby giving lived experience a remarkable depth and weave. I call it the palimpsest of memory. Palimpsest is, by definition, something reused or altered but still bearing a visible trace of its earlier form. We think of the sheer complexity of the human word, of poetry, and of music. Symbolic meanings that interlink, interweave, stretching out into infinite chains of signification. Each of us draws on our own experience, unrepeatable and elaborated into our personal symbolic meanings, our ways of being. The unconscious is then saturated with time, infinitely layered, plastic, and self-recursive. Aaron's work takes a 1,000-year view of the Ukrainian people's struggle for freedom, a worldview captured in the Novgorod Codex, a hyper-palimpsest of historical layering, music, poetry, language, culture, customs, myths, longings, and their remarkable relevance to what's happening now. The Ukrainian way of life, its people, its existence, its extraordinary richness of worldview hangs in the balance. Here, I mean worldview as mostly pre-reflective, before awareness, and sometimes beyond awareness. And by this pre-reflective worldview, we include, of course, the background of values, beliefs, personal meaning, and significance, and the entwined structural aspects of language, symbolic order, cultural imagined realities. But of utmost importance, our relationship in all of their overlapping, defining contexts, from family and friends to communities to local and national identities, all the intertwined aspects of our affirming social universe, all of the ways that we care about and love and live with others. We don't really apprehend the dimensions of the world as we know it until we lose it. We long to heal this brokenness of the world. Last week in the New York Times, I was moved by the words of a Ukrainian woman, Tatiana Bezhanova. Like a prayer, she said, "Somewhere people live calmly. Somewhere people live normally." This tenacity of the human spirit truly astonishes me. Her prayer, this story, this chorus of hope must prevail. It's about healing the future. It's about longing to come home to a world set right. The healing of the world may not be possible. Still, it is our nature to keep trying, searching for a way to come back home. What will our historical moment mean for us a year from now? A decade from now? About the future, we are in the dark, waiting to find out who we have been and who we might have been. The unconscious of our world, and yes, the conscious of our world, is that which awaits us. Today, we bear witness. And if you think that is not intimidating to read, let me tell you, it's very humbling to be asked to read those words, so thank you. Pavlo, you're up next. He is a fellow at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University, specializing in political theology, modern Slavonic Orthodoxy, religious nationalism, and peace building. The war in Ukraine is deeply infused with religious rhetoric on both sides. Why has religion, particularly Orthodox Christianity, played such a big role in the discourse? How can the Orthodox heritage of Ukraine and Russia help us understand the deeper historical and cultural roots of the war?
Thank you very much for the question and for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the concert to come. Three brief remarks. First of all, I think that in the region in general, but specifically in Ukraine, religion is more than just religion, as it's lived in the West. I think it's more holistic. When we are talking about the Novgorod Codex, we are talking about the period when the Kievan Rus was just baptized, yes, Christianized in a way, and to a certain degree it was a political move, an entrance to the family of civilized nations. Ukrainian, Russian, Eastern Slavonic alphabets came as a result of Rus of Kiev being baptized, Christianized. Yes, you needed to translate the holy books, the gospel, the psalms into a language that would be understood by the local population. Thus, you needed alphabet. So the very foundation of cultures in the Eastern Europe are a product of this country being Christian, getting a religion, being baptized. And diplomacy followed, science followed, literature followed, iconography followed, architecture followed. So it wasn't just, conversion which would, transform the way you pray or you approach the world. It was, I think, the entire culture was transformed. We lost something. I think we lost something with pagan culture. And I think we might be able to discover one day what we lost, but maybe we will never be able to discover. When you get something, you lose something. But I think it was the entry of the region into in a way, communication and communion with other regions. Now, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, the Kievan Rus of the time never produced theology. It got its religion from Byzantium, never produced interesting, intellectually stimulating texts. You won't find many of them. Maybe, the Novgorod Codex is an exception. I'm not sure, but it might be. But I think what has been produced was iconography, music, architecture. That is original. I think that is worth looking at. So in a way, this type of culture provoked a much more interesting and original reflection and reaction on part of the population of that region, not necessarily intellectual or speculative theological ideas. I think the church in that region also used to be more than just a church. Ukrainian nation lived without political representation, political sovereignty for centuries. Yes, Leah mentioned only a very short period between the Russian Revolution and 1920s. So often the clergymen, the church leaders, were the only class of people who were able to represent the population, represent Ukrainians. And in Ukraine it was the case until the I think almost the end of 20th century. A person of relevance in very recent history was Andrei Sheptytsky, a metropolitan of Ukrainian Catholic Church in Lviv, who saved a lot of Jews during the Second World War. And he was supporting culture, painting, music, but also local businesses. He would be speaking on behalf of Ukraine with the Austrians, with the Poles in Rome, with the Pope. There was no other representative for Ukrainians. So I think religion also is important as, in a way, a bearer of Ukrainian interests. And this wasn't the role played by churches in many other countries that had that political representation. And I think this there's also the lack of sovereignty, the lack of political institutions gave a special role to both religion but also to language, to literature, to music. They were, in a way, the markers of identity, not your passport, not your citizenship, not a flag that you didn't have. I remember when I was growing up in Ukraine, we would have Shevchenko's portrait. Shevchenko is a poet, Ukrainian poet. Portraits of him hang on the walls in many houses. Like, you wouldn't have this in Italy, Petrarca's or Dante's portrait, hanging on your wall. But in Ukraine, it was, in a way, the only legitimate way under Russian Empire, under communism, to declare your identity. So I think culture also played this role, which was more or less legitimate, unlike a political aspiration of Ukrainian nation. So I think it's more than just a product, of aesthetical value. It's something that would express identity of a group. The second point I would like to mention is, and I think this event when I was first invited to speak about, at an event on a text, recovered in Novgorod, today Russia, I was asked why. And I think there is a big history of a shared heritage, which is, I think, a blessing and a curse, a shared heritage between what is today Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Poland, Lithuania. If you look at the map of medieval Kievan Rus, yes, you would have Kiev, Halych, Polotsk in Belarus, Novgorod, which is today's Russia, as part of one state, united by a certain political tradition, certainly by religious tradition. I think early modernity brought a differentiation of different ethnicities. And I think Ukrainians, Belarusians developed very distinguished identity, different from that Russians developed. I think Ukraine was much more linked to what was going on in Europe. It was part of Reformation, Counter-Reformation, even within the Orthodoxy itself. The Kiev Mohila Academy would use Latin for its textbooks and classes. Muscovy was much more influenced by political culture of Golden Horde, etc. And at a certain point managed to sort of dominate and colonize the democratic culture of Novgorod Republic, but also of Kiev. So I think that the history, this shared history, is a big challenge, I think, for Ukrainians to think about, to speak about, especially because it has been weaponized, both in the Soviet Union, but also today by Putin, yes, who refers to this joint shared history, to St. Vladimir's, as a reason to claim that Ukrainians are not really a nation. They should not deserve to have their own country and right to self-determination. They are not a nation. They are sort of like Russians in disguise. But I think it's also, this shared history is also challenging for Ukrainians to think about, knowing that this can be, used as part of political propaganda. And I think the event that brings us today is a way to reflect, non-polemically about this heritage. Finally, the current war and the weaponization of both the shared heritage and of religion. Vladimir Putin, in the speech in which he announced the invasion of Ukraine, he claimed that he is coming to Ukraine in order to free Ukrainian Orthodoxy, which a few years before that has proclaimed its independence or autocephaly. from Russia. And we can hear today all sorts of like theopolitical arguments coming from Kremlin. Russia, by this war, is resisting not just Ukraine, it's resisting the Antichrist, the decadent West, the decadent Western culture. And very often the rhetoric is apocalyptical, religious. I think Ukraine as well has been using religiosity to argue. Ukrainian churches have been claiming that democracy is actually a Christian value. That is a reference to the Holy Trinity, yes, of three persons that live in communion, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. The revolution of dignity was a reference to human dignity, profoundly religious value. I think there was a boom of modern contemporary rethinking of iconography, all sorts of icons of Mary as a protector, as a woman that is mourning her killed children, Ukrainian soldiers. You might have seen the Madonna, Javelin Madonna with anti-tank missiles. And you have like plenty of like artistic rethinking of Christian heritage through this modern lens. Now a final thought, this palimpsest. Yes, wooden board on which you have different layers. I think it's a nice image also of Ukraine, of different layers. You don't even distinguish, you don't always understand which is which. What is, the pagan, what is the Byzantine, what is Kievan Rus, what is Polish, what is Crimean Tatar, what is Catholic, Polish, Austrian, Jewish, etc. It's a book of layers, and I think there is something beautiful about that. And my hope is that a war and reaction toward war, and the need of unity will not destroy this I think beautiful polyphonic heritage that Ukraine has. Thanks again.
Thank you, Pavlo. That's really thought-provoking. And you coming back to palimpsest brought me back to my topic really well, so thank you. Because I just wanted to mention that one of the experiences of doing this piece, so there's no movement in the piece in which there's only one idea going on. There's always, it's either two choirs, essentially, one of soloists and one the rest of us, or it's layered text so that, for example, the slow movement, we call it the slow movement, is a kind of gradual unraveling or unrolling of a text in a repetitive melodic sequence in each of the 8 parts. And because of the nature of the way it's kind of rolled out, you, the listener, can't really know what the grammatical sense of all of those lines are, but we, the singers, do. And it's sort of like we become a moment in his life, in a way. The day that he wrote this text, the alto twos know who they are, because they're singing words that make sense. But when you put it all together, it becomes, it's veiled. It's behind a veil in a way. And there's actually the most complex rhythmic movement is also sort of the same experience for the singers, because they all sing these different texts, but their texts to them makes sense. And it's quite an extraordinary thing, because the Crossing is particularly interested in what it feels like or what it's like to sing texts that you wouldn't say yourself, or that you might say yourself, but it wouldn't, it wouldn't be something that you would necessarily want to say yourself, like either anger or whatever. And what do we learn about the other when we sing these texts that we ourselves might not have written or said? So this piece gives us a lot to think about as we go on on the journey of it. Well, of course, we're also counting a lot because it's extremely rhythmic and it requires an awful lot of counting. But that's a really fun part of it. So I want to come back to Aaron for a second, and because we didn't really talk about the 20th century texts that are in this piece, and I think it's worth mentioning that not all of the texts are 1,000 years old. Some of them are within the last 100 years. And the way in which you've married them is really fascinating, wonderful. So can you talk about it for a second?
Sure, yeah. I'll start with the slow movement that you just mentioned. So each movement is a combination of words from the Novgorod Codex and a 20th century work by a writer in some state of exile. In that movement, that other text is a text by a man named André Singer, who was an Austrian Jew who came over to the United States during World War II, and actually founded Barnard College's music program and taught there for a long time. He was a composer, a conductor, and he also wrote poetry that was never published, but I got to know a man just down the street from me on the Upper West Side named George Wolfe, who was in charge of André Singer's estate and had copies of these poems. And so the text that really begins that movement is one of his studies, his poetic studies. So it's a kind of linking of different colors and imagery. So you get this line that says, yellow sails are white, white hair is gray, gray skies are blue. And so there's all these elisions of words in there. And so these are individual lines that are then given to these 8 voices. And then each part in the choir transitions to words that are drawn from the Novgorod Codex that I've kind of strung together in a similar kind of elided way. And so, we'll be projecting all of the text as the crossing sings it, so you can kind of see what that looks like. So each movement is really that kind of combination. So the first movement is a combination of, again, the Novgorod Codex and a work by Oscar Wilde called De Profundis, which he wrote in prison near the end of his life after he was convicted of sodomy for his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas. And it's a fascinating document. I suggest you read it. It's very different from the rest of Wilde's writing. And he wrote it in a very strange way where the warden would just give him one piece of paper at a time. And he would fill up that piece of paper. This was meant to be a letter to Alfred Douglas. And when he filled that page, they would take it away and they'd give him another page. So it's a very circular text because it kind of goes through the same ideas over and over again because he can't go back and look at what he's already written. So that's just a couple of examples of texts that are in there.
I am noticing that it's 6:30. And we were hoping to do some questions, but I need to conduct a concert in a little bit. Sure. I think you're coming to it. We probably need to wrap it up. I apologize. But I really, I'm going to just take a second and ask if you have any questions, particularly for Leah or Pavlo, who I feel like they're the people that bring the freshest information to us today. Do any of you have any questions for them? Okay, then I really am going to go conduct a concert in a little while. Okay? Thank you so much. Both of you offered so interesting. It's really great. And we really want to thank again Aaron for, this has been a long journey, and from concept to libretto to musical product to we had workshops, we played with it, we came up with the piece, we did it a few years ago, we knew we wanted to do it again and record it, which we did just this past week, and now here we are doing the New York premiere. So thank you, Aaron, that's really great of you, and thank you for coming.